The New Testament, as we have it, was originally written in Greek. Most of you know that probably. The first printed Greek Testament, coming off a printing press, happened in the year 1516, which means that for 1,500 years, the text that John and the others wrote was handed down by handwritten copies. For 1,500 years, it was copied by hand and passed on and on and on. That's significant. When this was printed in 1516, when the New Testament was printed in 1516, it simply turned the world upside down. And I should just pause here and say, if you want to read one of the best biographies that I've ever read, read David Daniels' biography of William Tyndale to read about that era and the heroism and sacrifice and reformation that this printing, so that anybody could read it, not just a few monks tucked away making faithful copies, but anybody who would take the time could have it in their hand. It simply turned the world upside down in 1516 and just beyond. But for 1,500 years, it came down to us in handwritten form. We do not have the original manuscript of any of the New Testament books. That is, the very piece of parchment or paper that John or Paul or Matthew or Mark or Luke wrote on. We don't have that piece of paper. Everything we have is copies. And the question is, did they get it right? Were they faithful with it? And frankly, I think it's probably just as well that we don't have those originals, because we make idols out of them and charge money probably for people to come worship at the shrine of the original manuscript of the Apostle Paul. So the books of the New Testament are all preserved by these faithful, hardworking scribes, copyists for all those centuries. Let me describe those manuscripts to you and give you some amazing facts. There are 4 ways that those manuscripts appear. One is a group called uncials, and I'll risk 3 or 4 technical words on you. We got some STEM guys in the room, and what we're talking about. Uncials mean capital letters in the Greek, and these are very old manuscripts. I'll tell you how many in a minute. The next group is minuscules, and they're the little Greek letters. So some were written in all caps, and some were written in little letters. And then there's a group called papyri. These are the oldest, and fragments, and written on papyrus, which was a plant common along the Nile in Egypt. Very precious manuscripts. And then the other group is lectionaries, collections of texts used in public worship, not in the order they were written necessarily, but just here's what you read this Sunday, here's what you read the next Sunday. So we've got all those. Now, here's what's simply amazing. The abundance of those manuscripts in those 4 different forms is so startling compared to the oldest manuscripts of any other manuscript coming from the 1st century. It's simply breathtaking. Let me give you some comparisons here so you can see what these so-called text critics, the scholars who are working on this, have to work with, and how that is a problem and a solution. Caesar's Gallic Wars, written about 50 BC, has 10 surviving manuscripts in the language in which it was written, and all of them date from the 10th century AD and after. Livy, the historian, his Roman history, dating from the time of Christ, 20 manuscripts survive of Livy's, which are all late. 2 manuscripts survive of Tacitus, Histories and Annals, written about AD 100. 2 manuscripts, and they're all from the 9th and 11th. They're both from the 9th and 11th century. 8 manuscripts exist for Thucydides' history which was written in 400 or so BC. So typically when you're a historian working with manuscripts that come from the period that we're talking about, very early, first century or so, you have 2, 8, 20 manuscripts to work with, and they're all 9th, 10th century, not earlier. And virtually all those historians working in universities around the world are confident they're interpreting Caesar and Thucydides and Tacitus. Compare the numbers of the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament. And these numbers come from Münster. There's one main large think tank called the Institute, I'll give it to you in English, for New Testament textual research in Münster, Germany, who have the data all collated. These manuscripts exist in libraries around the world, but of course they've been digitized now, and the numbers of these are plain for everybody to see, and if you have the energy, you can go look at them. There are 322 of those unsealed texts. There are 2,907 minuscule texts, manuscripts. There are 2,445 lectionary portions, and there are 127 papyri, adding up to about 5,801 manuscripts or fragments. They're not all complete New Testaments by any means, but they are either whole or fragments of the New Testament. So these handwritten copies, these 5,000 handwritten copies of the New Testament are in existence today and now are visible to the scholars who want to work with them to try to discern what the original words were that our biblical authors wrote. Now, as you can imagine, the copying of those texts produced variations for all kinds of human reasons, variations. So the multiplicity of the numbers of manuscripts increases the problem of variations and increases the powers of control by which we can assess which are the most original. The more you have, the more you can test which the original ones were. Just a simple example. If we only had, say, 2 manuscripts of the Gospel of John, and one of them included this story about the woman taken in adultery, and one of them omitted it, and they're both old, what would we do? It would be very difficult to decide. That's not the situation with any texts. The variations are many, but we have hundreds of texts, and so we can say, well, here it is in these 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, but here, the number of these texts, the antiquity of these texts, the geographical distribution of these texts makes it crystal clear that's the original right there. So the number, while creating more variations, also creates the very control that scholars are able to use in order to decide which is original. Here's the way F.F. Bruce, from a generation ago, put it. He wrote this in 1943. If the number of manuscripts increases the number of scribal errors, it increases proportionately the means of correcting such errors, so that the margin of doubt left in the process of recovering the exact original wording is truly remarkably small. But what's most significant for the reliability and the authority of the New Testament is that the variations that remain, that we still wonder about, do not affect any biblical doctrine. Here's the way Bruce puts it. The variant readings about which any doubt remains among textual critics of the New Testament affects no material question of historic fact or of Christian faith and practice. Now, nothing in the last, 70 years or so since he wrote that has changed in that judgment, in my judgment, except the fact that some very popular teachers, especially Bart Ehrman, have become renowned for calling the New Testament into question precisely on the basis of textual critical issues. His book is called Misquoting Jesus. There are other books, but that one especially. On the other hand, Paul Wegner, writing in 2006, reaffirms Bruce's judgment, and it would be mine. He writes like this 5 years ago. It is important to keep in perspective the fact that only a very small part of the text is in question. Of these, most variants make little difference to the meaning of any passage. And then he closes his book with this quote from Frederick Kenyon. It is reassuring at the end to find that the general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the Scriptures and our conviction that we have in our hands, in substantial integrity, the veritable Word of God. So I agree with Don Carson and the others that this story was not in the Gospel of John when he wrote it. And when I say that, I don't at all mean for you to respond, oh my, everything then is up for grabs. Or, how can I count on any text? On the contrary, you and I should be very thankful that in God's sovereign providence over the centuries, these thousands and thousands of manuscripts are so abundant today that in the science of textual criticism, as they are compared one with the other, there is a high degree of certainty that we have the original wording, and where there isn't a degree of certainty, it affects no doctrine of the Christian faith.